Amidst the storm, Tallula Lula Sparrow finds Zephyr Marlow, a fugitive harboring the dark secret of Thaddeus Teddy Marlow's death. When Lucian Blackthorn's forged files are exposed, justice and survival race against each other. Who will emerge alive? The night rain poured like a waterfall, pounding relentlessly on the old house's roof, each droplet striking the rusted tin with the force of war drums, echoing in rhythm. In the dim haze of the living room, an oil lamp flickered, casting faint streaks of light across the moldy wooden floor. Tallula Lula Sparrow sat huddled in an old armchair, eyes wide, staring out at the porch where a strange figure lay motionless, as if dead. Each thunderclap jolted her, her heart pounding so hard it stole her breath. Unable to bear it, she sprang up, grabbed a thick coat and flipped the switch for the porch light. A feeble yellow glow spilled out, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man, his tattered shirt soaked with mud and blood. A dried streak crusted across his temple. Rain lashed his shoulders in waves, yet he remained still, as if consciousness had abandoned him in the raging storm. Lula Sparrow's heart seemed to stop. She rushed to the door, her slippers squeaking on the wooden floor. The wind whipped fiercely, tossing her tangled hair across her face, chilling her to the bone. Kneeling beside him, her trembling fingers brushed the faint pulse at his wrist. Tears mingled with rain, sliding down her cheeks. "Can you hear me?" Her voice choked, rising above the gloomy air. Only the wind's howl through the door's cracks and her own racing heartbeat answered the silence. Then his fingers twitched. Slowly he turned, rain washing over the hard lines of his jaw, carrying away some of the dried blood. Zephyr Marlow cracked open his rain-soaked eyes, their gaze a mix of panic and pain, lips moving soundlessly. She quickly pulled him to sit against the wall, wet hair clinging to her cheeks. His voice rasped, "Don't call the police." Lula Sparrow froze on the rainy porch, her heart shattering. She glanced at the weathered wooden wall, a wave of dread surging within her. Beyond, the pine forest roared, branches clashing as if soothing the storm. But tiny beams of headlights flickering between the trees sent a chill down her spine. Suddenly the low growl of an engine rumbled in the distance, menacing like a whispered threat. "They're coming," she murmured. He frowned, his eyes sharp despite the weary whisper. "You don't want to know." But she'd made her choice. She wouldn't leave him alone in danger. Lula Sparrow slipped her arm under his shoulder, helping him stand. Rain lashed them, soaking her coat, each drop stinging her face, but she didn't stop. She muttered, as if passing warmth, "I won't let you die here." They trudged through the sodden gravel, each step sinking into soft earth, toward an old wooden stable. Lula Sparrow bent down, her legs trembling as she pried open a rotted plank beneath the water trough. The space before them was a dank, smoky burrow, a storm shelter heavy with the scent of wet straw. She urged, "Get in, quick." Zephyr Marlow braced himself on the plank, blood-smeared forehead glistening, eyes dazed but nodding obediently. He lowered himself into the pit, the cold earth making him shudder. She slammed the trapdoor shut, covering it with an old tarp, the rain's roar outside unrelenting, as if refusing to let go. Without hesitation, Lula Sparrow dashed to the stable's entrance to face three dark figures emerging from the muddy path. Headlights swept across, revealing the tall, imposing strangers in black coats, their strides menacing. The leader stepped forward, a crooked smile barely hiding his lethal intent. "Sorry to bother you, miss. We're looking for someone who passed through." Lula Sparrow flinched, her eyes flashing with defiance, her voice trembling but firm. "This is private land. I haven't seen anyone." The stranger's tone dropped, slurring like a confession. "A guy in a cowboy hat, about 60, got lost and caused trouble." She frowned, her hand tightening around the small knife in her pocket, answering sharply, "I don't know anything." After a tense pause, the three figures turned, grumbling as they retreated to their vehicle and vanished into the rain's curtain. Lula Sparrow exhaled softly, hurrying back to the shelter, flinging open the trap door, her face pale in the faint light. Inside a small, warm room, the smell of smoke mingled with the sharp tang of antiseptic from an empty alcohol bottle. Lula Sparrow frantically gathered bandages, gauze, and a bowl of warm water. Each drop of alcohol on his torn temple made Zephyr Marlow wince, groaning softly as she carefully cleaned the crusted blood. Fresh blood seeped into the white bandage, spreading like a fractured map. She held back tears, taking a deep breath before whispering, "It won't take long." The bandage rustled as she wrapped it, skillfully pressing it over the wound. His breathing was heavy, lips trembling. "You're not a nurse." She met his gaze, her eyes blazing. "I'm just someone who doesn't want you to die." When things settled, Zephyr Marlow closed his eyes, breathing raggedly before muttering, "Teddy." A name, faint as if echoing from a nightmare. Lula Sparrow paused, her blood-stained hand gently touching his forehead, asking softly, "Teddy?" His voice was weak. "Thaddeus, Teddy Marlow, my brother." A sharp pang of sorrow surged through her, like 100 knives piercing her heart. Drake Memorial Hospital flashed in her mind, tied to rumors of an unjust death. The room fell quiet, only his steadier breathing and the distant patter of rain breaking the silence. Amid the storm, blood, tears, and mystery, Lula Sparrow knew she hadn't just saved a stranger. She'd touched the thread of fate, where truth and justice awaited revelation. The shelter's trapdoor closed, leaving the two in temporary refuge within the darkness, surrounded by the wet pine forest and relentless rain, a reminder that the journey ahead would be long, perilous, and resolute. The night descended, black as thick velvet, the wind whistling through the window frames, making the wooden shutters creak, while the geckos on the walls seemed to turn their rustling into ghostly moans. Tallula Sparrow leaned against the porch post, her heart pounding louder than the rain on the tin roof. Suddenly, a headlight beam sliced across the yard, startling as a burst of fury. White streaks painting jagged patterns on the wet gravel. The roar of engines echoed, piercing the eerie silence. She shut her eyes tightly, then opened them. 3 black pickups crept into the yard, their headlights flickering across the wooden wall, casting distorted, dancing shadows. Rain poured relentlessly, water streaming off the hoods, mingling with the engine's rumble and the patter of droplets, creating a chaotic symphony of nature and danger. The first figure stepped from the truck, tall and broad, a soaked scarf around his neck, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. He tipped his cap, a cold smile never reaching his eyes. "We're just patrolling." His voice was low and hoarse, laced with mockery. His flashlight beams swept across the weathered wood, then settled on her. She felt small under the blinding light and the stranger's imposing bulk. The wind lashed her shoulders, rain soaking her coat, chilling her skin. But Lula Sparrow's heart held steady, refusing to yield. "This is private land," she said firmly, each word sharp as an arrow. "I haven't seen anyone pass through." Her voice rang out against the rain and engines, dry and commanding. He frowned, resting a hand on his mud-soaked coat, his tone half teasing, half threatening. "A guy in a cowboy hat, about 60, got lost and caused trouble. You sure?" A second stretched into eternity, filled only by the rain's patter and their mingled breaths. She smirked faintly, her gaze icy. "I live here alone. No strangers come by at night." The word strangers landed like a challenge, freezing the air with tension. The second man approached, his flashlight sweeping through the stable door's gap, his eyes narrowing at the wet, puddled ground. He glanced at his partner, leaning in to whisper, "She's not joking." Turning back, he forced a smile, raising his voice. "No need to get upset, ma'am, just doing our job." Lula Sparrow's eyes flared at the word job. Crossing her arms, she snapped, "I said I haven't seen anyone. If there's nothing else, you're disturbing my sleep." Her words cut like a blade, silencing any rebuttal. The 3 figures turned, their steps hurried, climbing back into their trucks. The slam of doors echoed through the rain, tires crushing gravel as they drove off, leaving a desolate silence. Lula Sparrow watched the headlights fade, like ice melting into a rushing stream. She exhaled sharply, brushing back wet hair, and turned toward the stable. The rain still pounded outside, unyielding, but inside, time seemed to pause. Lula Sparrow knelt by the storm shelter, her trembling hands pulling back the tarp and lifting the rotted wooden trapdoor. Below, Zephyr Marlow leaned against the cold brick wall, eyes closed, chest rising and falling with faint breaths. She startled at how small and fragile he seemed compared to the man from the night before. Yet this same man carried a secret big enough to draw a pack of killers after him. Raindrops dripped from his nose, soaking into the bruised corner of his mouth. She knelt beside him, placing a hand on his forehead, feeling faint warmth in the icy space. "Zephyr," she called softly, her voice suddenly full of care. He gave a weak smile, a spark of gratitude in his eyes before they closed again. She pulled a small flashlight from her pocket, flicking it on, its dim beam illuminating the peeling straw-strewn shelter. She grabbed a wool blanket from the corner, draping it over his shoulders. The rain hammered the tarp above like 1,000 worries converging, but Lula Sparrow's slow, deliberate movements, spreading the blanket, adjusting the pillow, setting down a bowl of warm water, and murmuring comfort, wove an invisible strength that dispelled the gloom. Each gesture was meticulous. Her hand swiftly applied antiseptic, gently wiping dried blood, then pressed gauze to his torn forehead, wrapping the bandage with rhythmic precision. The only sounds were the rustle of fabric against skin and his soft breathing. She switched off the flashlight, placing it in the corner, leaving only the faint glow of a lone candle. In the stifling shelter, two strangers clung to each other amidst the stormy night. Lula Sparrow rested her hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat slow but grow steadier. She smiled, whispering into the air, "I'm still here. I won't let you die." Outside, the three figures had vanished into the rain, leaving an uncanny stillness, as if no tragedy had ever occurred, only the warmth of courage and hope lingering in the dark. The morning unfolded in quiet after the storm, with only the soft whisper of wind through the window cracks and the last droplets pattering on the tin roof. Tallula Sparrow gently lifted the thick blanket over Zephyr Marlow's shoulders, the faint glow of a hearthside candle dancing on the thin fabric. She leaned in, checking his breathing, hearing the faint rise and fall of his chest. In the room heavy with the scent of antiseptic and damp earth, she set a small tray on the table, 2 steaming mugs of tea, a bowl of warm porridge, a slice of buttery brown bread, and a glass of water. Each of Lula's movements was deliberate, every clink of the spoon, every breath blown to cool the porridge, as if trying to preserve a fragile thread of life. She pressed a warm glass to his lips, guiding him awake through the cocoon of blankets. His eyes, hazy but recognizing her, flickered with a faint smile, though his face remained pale. The only sounds were the crackle of the hearth and his softening breaths. Zephyr Marlow cracked open his eyes. The bandage around his head still showed traces of dried blood, tinged with the scent of alcohol. Lula Sparrow gently propped a pillow higher, slipping a small thermometer under his tongue. She closed her eyes, waiting, then saw the mercury climb to 38.5 dCc. The fever's spike sent her scrambling to press a cold cloth to his forehead, her heart twisting. Turning to the corner, she grabbed a medical kit, a few painkillers, a bottle of first-aid antibiotics, and a vial of disinfectant. She carefully measured doses, instructing softly, "Take it slow. Don't rush." Each word she spoke seemed etched into the silent air, painting a scene of care laced with worry. He nodded faintly, shifting to grasp the medicine cup with trembling hands, swallowing the antibiotics with a resolve not to give up. Pale golden light slipped through the window, the curtains swaying gently in the breeze, but Lula Sparrow's mind still echoed with the engines and headlights from the night before. She shivered, recalling his whispered words. They'll find me. He resisted the idea of a hospital, his voice low and weary. No, they'll track this place. For a moment, Lula looked up, wondering if she should call Sheriff Barnabas Barney Hayes, but only heard herself murmur, "I can't let them find you." She quietly tucked her phone into her coat pocket, her eyes flashing with resolve and concern. She squeezed his hand, as if passing him a spark of courage, and said softly, "I trust you, but we're not going anywhere. Not until I'm sure you're safe." Her voice was warm, cutting through a veil of doubt woven with quiet faith. He met her gaze, his eyes wavering for a moment before hardening, but he didn't protest. Finally, Lula Sparrow stood, her small frame steady in the warm room, her hands resting on his shoulders, her gaze unmistakable. She declared firmly, "You're not going anywhere until I say so." Her words landed like a soft explosion, igniting a spark in Zephyr Marlow's eyes. He smirked faintly, his voice hoarse. "You're convincing, Lula." Warmth flooded the space as she smiled back. "That's the job of an unlicensed nurse with a heart. Now rest until the sun's fully up." Zephyr brushed a bead of sweat from her forehead, his eyes softer than ever. They sat in silence, listening to each other's breathing in a room filled with the scent of warm tea and hope. In that moment, a fragile trust between two strangers took root, like a green shoot pushing through heavy, muddy earth, promising a tomorrow no longer faced alone. In the pale sunlight of a languid afternoon, Tallula Lula Sparrow sat in an old armchair, watching Zephyr Marlow hobble in from the forest behind the house. The air was so still that only the crunch of dry leaves under his feet broke the silence. Peach-hued light bathed his beard, flecked with dried blood and the bandage on his temple. He sank into a chair by the tea table, his trembling hands grasping a cup but not daring to sip. Lula set her teacup on the tray, leaning closer, her voice low and mournful like a lullaby. "Do you want to tell me about Teddy?" A thin tear traced her cheek, a soft sob lingering on her lip. The dim sunlight through the window cast their shadows on the worn wooden floor. Two souls trapped in the weight of life's burdens. Zephyr Marlow sighed, his fingers brushing an old photo on the table, a snapshot of two brothers laughing in an autumn garden, golden leaves falling around them. That moment, like forest leaves fading in late fall's light, felt impossibly distant. He touched the photo's edge, his voice breaking with each word. "Teddy, Thaddeus Carter Marlow, my brother. He was the heart of Drake Memorial before it all fell apart." The room hushed, filled only with the steam rising from the teapot and the ticking of a clock. Lula listened to every word, her ears catching the hawk-like whispers of memory. He spoke of a bleak morning when Teddy uncovered tampered prescriptions, a discordant note in a faded symphony. His younger brother, driven by the pure zeal of medicine, exposed the underdosing and swapping of patients' drugs, but truth was a dagger to the reputation of certain board members. He faltered, his eyes tinged with sorrow like a flower trembling in a gust. "They only didn't spare Teddy. They forced him to stay silent." Lula clasped her hands as if holding on to the last warmth after a storm. Her face bore deep compassion, her heart shattering with each revelation. As a light afternoon rain began to patter, Zephyr Marlow looked up, his eyes calm with restrained fury. "Lucian Blackthorn was behind it all," he said, the three words heavy as boulders on his chest. His voice was cold as steel. He and a few others on the board traded patients' health for illicit profits. Teddy found out, and they feared the truth would ruin their reputations so. He closed his eyes, lips pressed tight, as if suppressing a blaze of anger in his chest. Lula felt the air around her grow numb, the wind whistling through the door's cracks like an arrow's cry, taunting her rage. The darkness seemed to coil around Lucian Blackthorn's name, staining dreams of peace. In that moment, Lula Sparrow stood, her eyes blazing with resolve. She reached out, gripping Zephyr Marlow's shoulders as if pouring all her strength into him. The rain outside softened, making way for the steady beat of her heart. She spoke, her voice bolder than ever. "Zephyr, we'll show him the truth can't stay buried. I'm here with you, and I won't let a coward like Lucian Blackthorn trample Teddy's memory." Each word sliced through the darkness, igniting a radiant hope. Zephyr Marlow met her gaze, his eyes softening with a hint of encouragement. "You're brave, Lula. Not everyone has the courage to stand with me when I stir up a storm." She smiled, daring the tempest. "Then let me shatter that calm. Justice is our storm." They stood in the warm room, the rain outside like a nod of approval. The room was no longer a hideout. It became a trench, where two allies vowed to defend the truth. As the afternoon ended, Lula Sparrow pulled an old notebook from a drawer, handing it to Zephyr Marlow. Its pages were scrawled with Teddy's handwriting, ink smudged by time. The oil lamp's glow illuminated the words, "I keep my healer's heart, no matter who hides the truth." She traced the lines, whispering, "We won't let these words fade." He nodded, his lips brushing her palm, warmer than any vow. Outside, the rain stopped, only a few final drops tapping the eaves. Lula Sparrow and Zephyr Marlow stood together, gazing into the vast expanse. They knew the road ahead held dangers, but with each other and a pledge for justice, they were ready. The fragments of grief, rage, and fierce resolve, once separate, now fused into a great flame, poised to burn away the remnants of crime. Chapter 4 closed with a resolute sigh, opening a march where justice would echo on. The night stretched taut like black silk, cold gusts rippling through the cracks of the old stable, stirring in Tallula Lula Sparrow's chest, the ragged breath of fear. Suddenly, the roar of engines erupted, headlights sweeping across the wet yard, drowning the trees' shadows in a blur of light and dark, like a nightmare's flicker. 3 black pickups tore through the fence, tires grinding gravel into a spray, screeching to a halt before the stable like a snarling beast. Lula Sparrow froze, then, with a reflex, slipped into the storm shelter beneath the water trough, her face pressed against the damp wooden wall, her heart pounding until she could barely breathe. A headlight beam sliced through the shelter's slit, casting a pale streak on the ground, then vanished as the trucks roared deeper into the yard. The stable door creaked open, and 3 dark figures stepped in, the wet rustle of their raincoats shrieking in their eyes scanned every shadowed corner before one growled, "Didn't we say we saw no one, miss?" His voice echoed through the trees like a challenge. Lula Sparrow bit her lip, steadying her breath, her heart racing but her eyes blazing with resolve. "No one's been here tonight." Without waiting, the 3 turned on their heels, headlights fading into the rain, leaving the stable silent and Lula's body radiating heat. In a flash, Tallula spotted Zephyr Marlow leaning against the stable's low brick wall, the wind carrying the faint ripple of water from the drainage ditch. She flicked on her flashlight, its dim yellow glow spreading over his form, sodden bandage around his head, mud-caked shirt clinging to his skin. In an instant, he seemed more alert, his eyes flashing with fierce determination. Before he could react, she yanked him up. "We have to run now." Outside, the truck's rumble lingered, buzzing like a shattered hive. Zephyr Marlow glanced at his soaked boots, then at the horse calmly grazing in the stable's corner. The shelter offered no more refuge, and staying meant being trapped. He nodded, then, in a swift, ghost-like motion, vaulted onto the horse's back. The wind from the horse's steps whipped through Lula Sparrow's rain-drenched hair, urging her to retreat to safety. As Zephyr Marlow fixed his far-off gaze, the horse surged into the vast yard, hooves chewing gravel, the truck's tires closing in like molten iron arrows. He hunched low, gripping the mane, wind lashing his face, grit and stones pelting his body, his eyes blazing in the dark. Each hoofbeat slammed into the wet earth like a war drum, filling the air with the cadence of life and death. The pickups accelerated, headlights flickering like fire ants in pursuit. Lula Sparrow shrank into the stable's corner, her head resting on a wooden beam, counting the hoofbeats distant, near, distant. Her heart stretched taut by distance and dread. A faint moon hung through the branches, casting dappled patches of light and shadow on the rutted dirt path. Zephyr Marlow leaned low, his vision sharpening to each strange glint. He veered into a grassy patch, mist swirling at the horse's feet, kicking up white clouds. His hand stroked the saddle, whispering encouragement. Go, go, go. The horse neighed, hooves pounding, leaping over pooled water, droplets scattering in silver arcs against the night. The engine's roar weakened, tearing the air into fragments, like a nightmare shrinking. Through the tree-lined corridor, Zephyr Marlow sometimes glimpsed his reflection in the mist, his tall, lean frame cutting sharp lines. Headlights occasionally pierced the canopy, flashing like wild torches, forcing him to hug the forest's edge, holding his breath to stay hidden. The scent of damp earth clung to his nose, dewdrops on countless leaves like 1,000 watching eyes. Zephyr Marlow didn't look back, hearing only the relentless hoofbeats and his own breath echoing in the void. The horse splashed through a shallow creek, hooves sinking, charging across rocky gullies, mud spraying in a wet curtain, then bolting up a slope. He urged the horse with a low shout, spurring it toward the thickening fog. And then, in an instant, Zephyr Marlow vanished into the white mist, the horse's piercing neigh carrying his shadow as he navigated the wild forest. The three pickups screeched to a stop at the ridge, headlights probing the ravine. Engines panting before falling silent, finding no trace. In the mist, only the saddle's imprint lingered in the mud, the sole relic of a breathtaking battle. In the stable, Tallula Lula Sparrow shakily rose, stepping to the shelter, gently pulling a wool scarf scented with smoke to wipe the mud from her face. She pressed her hand to the wooden wall, closing her eyes, her heart pulsing with sharp pangs. The hoofbeats faded, giving way to the weary sigh of the She exhaled, her lips whispering Zephyr. His name rang through the night like a vow, an echo of unquenched hope. In the thin mist at the forest's edge, she believed that even if his shadow had vanished, he was still there, guiding her to trust in tomorrow. And that fog would never be thick enough to hide one truth. Life finds a way through every darkness. As Zephyr Marlow had charged toward the light, defying the endless night, the night sky hung with faint stars, streetlights scattered like stray notes across the silent desert. Tallula Lula Sparrow steered her old truck through the gravel road to Drake Memorial Hospital's side gate. The scene outside was breathless, only the crunch of tires and Lula's steady breaths filling the cab. She locked the door, slung a small document bag over her shoulder, and stepped into the long, dim hallway where flickering fluorescent lights painted dancing streaks of light and shadow on stained walls. Each step stirred the dust of time on the damp tiles, leading her to room 417, Dr. Ambrose Wren's old office, the only one who dared keep backup records when the board demanded their destruction. The heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing a scarred desk buried under papers and an ancient typewriter. Dr. Ambrose Wren sat hunched behind it, his salt and pepper hair disheveled, his sad, pensive eyes boring into the pulse of memory. He reached out, a faint smile softening the wrinkles around his eyes. "Lula, you're earlier than I expected." His voice was warm, but tinged with unease, like someone relieved to find an ally in a lonely desert. Lula replied softly, "I need evidence, Doctor. The truth we're waiting for can't stay buried forever." She set her bag on the desk, the warm yellow lamplight glinting off its waterproof cover, evoking a small oasis in the desert. Wren stood, crossing to a tall cabinet locked with an old combination lock, each turn of the knob creaking as if waking long-dormant memories. "Keeping lives secret is hard. Keeping records is 100 times harder," he sighed, entering the code. The cabinet cracked open, releasing a musty scent mixed with old antiseptic. Dozens of yellowed folders stood neatly aligned, each labeled in scrawled handwriting. Pharmacy logs, Q4 2012, XX, treatment transfer lists, July. Internal minutes, confidential. Lula's eyes scanned them, her heart racing at the revelations to come. Wren pulled out a thick, worn, leather-bound folder, its edges frayed. This is the pharmacy's drug ledger from that year, saved before they forced me to shred it, he said, gently placing the first page on the desk. Lula leaned in, her eyes gleaming. "Show me the forged signatures and erasures, Doctor." A small flashlight beam lit the slanted text, ink smudged from repeated alterations. She pointed to the injection a dosage entry, a faint crossed-out line overlaid with fresh ink. Note: increase dose by 20%. Lula's trembling hand traced the ink, as if touching the heartbeat of truth. Wren turned the page, his voice catching. "They forced me to sign off, but my heart knew it was a lie." He showed Lula a concealed order bearing a forged seal, marked close investigation records, signed by Lucian Blackthorn and 2 board members. Each stamp was a nail in Justice's coffin, but now, under the feeble light, their flaws stood stark. Lula meticulously noted details, sketching a web of signatures, her eyes fixed on dates and numbers. Suddenly, Wren opened a side drawer, pulling out a thin, black-bound journal. "This is Teddy's notebook," he said, handing her the faded book. "Henry wrote about covert experiments, warned of risks, before—" Lula's hands trembled as she took the journal, its musty papers smelling of memory. She opened the first page. Teddy's neat handwriting, tinged with anxiety, read, "August 12, drug counts don't match records. I'll uncover the truth." Each line carved into her heart, undeniable proof of Zephyr's brother's integrity and the injustice that buried him. Wren leaned against the window, hand on the sill, gazing at the gray mool night sky. "Thanks to you, my burden has meaning again." Lula nodded, a surge of reverence and solemnity welling within her. Before leaving, Lula stepped close to Wren, whispering, "I'll protect everything you've given me." He smiled, resting a hand on her shoulder, his eyes conveying trust and hope. "Keep this place secret, Lula. Hide the documents well. Justice can't be rushed." She nodded, lifting the document bag, each step out of the room weighed by the heavy folders, carrying a turning point in the history of compassion and crime. Back at the cabin, Tallula Lula Sparrow rushed into the living room, setting the bag on the round table. Zephyr Marlow sat slumped in a chair, his wistful eyes flickering with hope. Lula opened the bag, pulling out the ledger, journal, and forged orders. Zephyr squinted, his eyes widening as the evidence came into sharp focus. The warm room fell silent, only their racing heartbeats breaking the... Zephyr slowly lifted the journal, his trembling hands turning the pages. "This." Teddy fought to the end. His voice was hoarse, his eyes sparking with renewed faith. Lula smiled, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Now justice won't stay buried." Outside, the night breeze murmured, the stacked documents quivering as if proclaiming, "The truth is in courageous hands." Chapter 6 closed with the relieved breaths of 2 allies, in the darkness where the lamp of investigation had kindled a flame of hope. The steady ticking of the town hall's wall clock echoed like the march of an invisible army, guiding Tallula Lula Sparrow and Zephyr Marlow toward their long-hatched plan. They stepped into the hushed room under dim fluorescent lights, where rows of wooden chairs stood in solemn order and a weathered oak table awaited the key players. In the room's corners, beneath the faint glow of lamps, Sheriff Barnabas Barney Hayes quietly adjusted a tiny recording device into a crevice by the table's edge, his eyes flashing with stern trust. Nearby, a camera hidden under a nameplate's lid stood ready to capture every move. The scent of old wood, dusty papers, and the charged air of strategy mingled in the stillness, foretelling a storm of words about to erupt. Lula Sparrow retreated into the shadows at the room's end, her hands gripping a metallic briefcase that glinted faintly under the light, containing the pharmacy ledger, Thaddeus Marlow's journal, and Lucian Blackthorn's forged documents. Her heartbeat thrummed through her thin sweater, like war drums sounding before battle. Nearby, Zephyr Marlow adjusted the projector's light to highlight the faded logo of the old hospital, now printed on the meeting invitations. A sweet bait concealing a sharp blade. Crisp footsteps rang on the tiled floor as three dark figures entered. Lucian Blackthorn led, his shoulders like iron, his harsh features etched with arrogance. The other two board members wore hesitant expressions but feigned coldness. They lined up at the table, their eyes scanning without suspecting the trap awaiting them. When Zephyr Marlow stepped forward, slamming the hall door shut, the bolt's sharp click signaled the start of the fight. His gaze met Lula's, a subtle nod, the silent signal of two allies. Lula Sparrow rose, gliding to the table's center, lifting a thick curtain of documents to reveal two gleaming folders. One a funding reinstatement proposal, the other a catalog of evidence. A breeze through the window stirred the pages, hinting at the gates of justice cracking open. She smiled, just enough to mask the footsteps of fate, then spoke calmly. "Thank you for coming. Today we review Carter Memorial's commitments. I introduced Zephyr Marlow, its founder and manager, before the incident." Her voice slid through the air like a thin blade, slicing through the veil of doubt. Lucian Blackthorn smirked, letting out a faint scoff as if victory were assured, and said, "Hello, Zephyr. We're here to learn why you've returned." His eyes held a challenge. Zephyr didn't flinch, merely nodding politely, then placed a document before them. "Let's review our work with the Teddy Carter Fund. Then I'd love to hear the board's constructive input." His hand slid over the page, erased ink glaring under the light, undeniable scars of crime. The board members hesitated, the lamp's glow catching faint sweat on Lucian Blackthorn's brow as his eyes darted toward the recorder, but his hand subtly brushed the seal on the table, hiding his fear. Lula Sparrow gripped Zephyr's arm, her heart pounding with urgency. This was the moment storm met tempest. The meeting's voices rose, Zephyr's calm tone guiding through slides reaffirming the fund's value. Then, to discrepancies in the pharmacy logs. When he reached the forged signature map dated August 12, Lucian Blackthorn snapped. "You're accusing me of altering records? Where's your proof?" He pounded the table, each thud a plea for a talisman. Zephyr smiled, slowly inserting a USB into the projector. The forged signature loomed large on the screen, gray crossouts tearing through false honor under white light. The air choked, each breath heavy. Lucian Blackthorn's face reddened, his stammered defenses echoing through the microphone, captured by the hidden device. His admission, "Yes, I ordered the dose increase for illicit profit," blared through the speakers, silencing the other board members, who sat stunned, awaiting their fate. Their faces sagged, wrinkles deepening, eyes dodging the camera. When Tallula Lula Sparrow met Sheriff Barnabas Barney Hayes's solemn gaze, he nodded, flashing his penlight as a signal. "We have everything." His voice was warm but firm. "Thank you for clearing the truth." Instantly, the door burst open. Two officers stormed in, guns drawn, arresting Lucian Blackthorn and his cohorts. The document's text flared like a verdict between freedom and captivity. The clank of handcuffs on Blackthorn's wrists resounded, and the hall door closed on Lula and Zephyr's tense gazes. They stood, facing undeniable evidence, exhaling as Carter Memorial's name shone in the light of justice. Chapter 7 closed amid radio commands and the chaotic footsteps of justice, opening a new journey where no storm could sweep away the safeguarded truth. The gunshot cracked like wind-shattering glass as Lucian Blackthorn lurched from his chair, his revolver flashing under the flickering fluorescent lights. Time froze for a moment, his face twisted with rage, his icy eyes painting a wordless threat. Zephyr Marlow reacted, lunging like a steel spear through the air, shoving Tallula Lula Sparrow back to shield her. The bullet tore through his chest, ripping his blood-soaked shirt, spraying fabric and pain like a red-hot blade searing his side. Lula Sparrow's scream erupted, echoing through the silent hall, jolting every heart. He spun, clutching the wound, yet still held her tightly, his lips trembling. "Lula, run," before collapsing in the stance of a fallen martyr. Hot blood spread, dripping onto the oak floor in vivid red streaks, pulsing like the final dance of Justice's dream. Instantly, more gunfire shattered the air and the room's door flew open. Sheriff Barnabas Barney Hayes stormed in with his deputy, his silver hair glinting under the lights, his stern face radiating resolve. "Nobody leaves." He gestured sharply, ordering the officers to close in. Boots pounded, medical kits and handcuffs clattered against leather belts. Reporters cowered in their seats. 2 officers tackled Lucian Blackthorn, pinning him to the table. Guns trained on him. He roared, eyes flashing with bitter tears, but could no longer raise his weapon. Amid the chaos, Lula Sparrow scrambled to Zephyr Marlow's side, her trembling hands tearing off her coat, pressing them against the bullet wound to stem the blood. Blood gushed through her fingers, staining her white shirt, its metallic scent tolling like a death knell. She whispered, pouring warmth into her words, "I won't let you die, Zephyr. Hold on." Her voice choked, mingling with the wail of sirens rising outside. Paramedics rushed in, lifting him onto a stretcher, her dress catching on its legs. She knelt, gripping his hand to steady it, her eyes locked on the gray-blue gash. Officers hustled the suspects out, the clank of handcuffs piercing the air. Sheriff Hayes barked, "Clear the way for the ambulance." The hall doors swung wide, red and blue lights from the ambulance flooding the foyer. Doctors and nurses swarmed the stretcher, needles and oxygen tanks glinting on the sliding gurney. A nurse secured an IV, a doctor clamped a suction tube, and a tourniquet was tied above the wound. Lula Sparrow stood behind, sweat soaking her brow, eyes red but never letting go of his hand, whispering, "You'll live to see justice, you have to." Her voice broke, yet rang through the haze of gunpowder and antiseptic. Before the stretcher rolled to the ambulance, Zephyr Marlow gripped her shoulder, lips quivering. "Thank you, Lula." A drop of blood clung to her finger. She bent to kiss it, then held him tightly as the vehicle sped from the hall. The siren wailed relentlessly, flashing lights like a tolling bell. Lulu Sparrow clung to the ambulance's edge, her heart lurching, eyes following his fading form, then lost entirely, leaving only the engine's hum and the siren's echo. The night cloaked everything in stillness as Lulu Sparrow, returned to the cabin, blood-stained and pale, her eyes burning with resolve. She stepped silently onto the wooden floor, filled a basin with warm water in the kitchen, scrubbed the first-aid clothes, then sank into the old armchair in the living room. Her heart sank with each beat, but her will held firm. "He's not dead yet," she whispered. The distant ambulance siren mingled with the muted news broadcast's theme, reporting, "Several board members arrested at the scene." The news flickered like a spark in the dark, reminding her. Justice was sounding its opening note. Chapter 8 closed in ragged breaths and the lingering tang of blood, amid the hum of engines and sirens echoing beyond sight, evoking a will unextinguished despite bullets finding a heart. In the damp darkness, Lula Sparrow knew she had touched the edge of sacrifice, but with it rose a fierce belief. If one heart for justice could fall, its soul would live forever. The ventilator hummed beside the hospital bed, its LED lights blinking in steady rhythm like a second heart beating in the cold room. Tallula Sparrow sat hunched by the mattress, her eyes fixed on Zephyr Marlow's gaunt face, her nose filled with the sharp scent of antiseptic and the dampness of crisp white sheets, her chest weighed down by invisible stones. Outside the window, the wail of ambulances had faded down the long corridor, leaving only the faint echo of early night. Lula didn't move, her arm gripping the bed rail, her slender fingers brushing the sheet's edge each time the vital monitor beeped, a sound brimming with hope, yet teetering on the edge of dread. Zephyr Marlow's face was ashen, his cracked lips trembling in delirium, faint blue veins snaking across his temple where the bullet had stolen part of his breath. Each rasping inhale from the oxygen mask crashed like waves against a cliff, reminding Lula he still clung to the line between life and death. She gently lifted the sheet, placing her palm on his forehead. Her whisper choked. "I'm here. Don't let go." But only the machine's drone and his labored breathing answered. In the still night, Lula Sparrow pulled a worn letter from her coat pocket, its edges yellowed from years of hiding. It was Thaddeus Teddy Marlow's letter, his careful handwriting tinged with sorrow. She unfolded it, the desk lamp's glow illuminating the page like a window to the past. "If you're reading this, I might already be," she read silently, the scent of old paper curling around her. "But know every step I took was for justice. Don't let cowards bury my truth." Lula looked at Zephyr Marlow, a tear rolling down her cheek, her heart splintering into 1,000 pieces of grief. An unwavering she pressed the letter to his chest, feeling the heart monitor spike as if answering a distant call. She set the letter on the stainless steel table beside the bed, amid scattered vials, medical tools, and IV lines. In the hazy blue mist of hand sanitizer, Lula leaned toward the monitor, whispering, "Teddy bet his life on the truth. You have to live for him." The monitor's beat blended with her voice, forming a hymn of strength and will. Moments later, the screen jolted, the heart rate surging. Lula's heart leapt. Zephyr Marlow's fingers twitched. Then his eyes fluttered open. Lula gasped, her gaze a mix of joy and fear. "You awake?" Her voice choked. He turned toward her, his clouded eyes slowly focusing, his voice hoarse. "It's been too long." Each word gleamed like a gem from a deep abyss, warming her heart. She leaned closer, resting her hand on his weakly flexing fingers. "I was scared I'd lose you." Her voice shattered, but was pieced back together by unshakable faith. Zephyr Marlow squeezed her hand faintly, his eyes soft yet etched with longing. "You stayed, didn't you?" Her tears fell fast, mingling with his warm breath after days of coldness. She nodded, gripping his hand tighter. "Of course." The alarm's wail faded beyond the room, leaving only the monitor's gentle hum, like a lullaby closing a chapter of revival. Lula leaned against the bed, her head resting near his neck, whispering, "Teddy would be proud." He smiled weakly, his eyes glinting with hope. "Teddy's smiling." The letter from his brother, with its vow to never yield, had become the catalyst for Zephyr's return. Though his body remained frail, the wound still throbbing with each IV drip, Lula Sparrow never took her eyes off his face, or her hand from his. She draped a thin blanket over him, then leaned down, pressing a slow kiss to his forehead, tasting the breath of life and hope. His awakening wasn't just for his body. It reignited her heart, lifting them both from the ashes of darkness. Chapter 9. Closed in the ICU's warm glow, where white lights mingled with eyes yearning for life, amid distant nurses' footsteps and the monitor's soft beeps. Each breath Zephyr Marlow took became a gentle melody, lulling an unfinished dream of justice until a radiant new day dawned. This rebirth through pain etched a truth. Though a body may fall, the soul of justice can rise again through love and unyielding faith. As dawn broke, pale golden sunlight sketched the first lines on the blank page of a new day. Tallula Sparrow stood behind the flower-lined fence at the main gate of the Thaddeus Carter Healing Center, formerly Drake Memorial. A bustling crowd gathered on the sprawling lawn, a green silk tapestry, with the hum of news cameras and the snap of reporters' lenses trained on the speaker's podium. Ambulances lined the curb in solemn formation, their flashing lights like artificial stars heralding a fresh start. The early breeze carried the faint scent of incense from candles near the flagpole, where a flag bearing a heart and cross rose slowly, fluttering gently. Zephyr Marlow stepped onto the brown wooden podium, his white shirt damp with morning dew, his eyes alight with faith and resolve. Applause crashed like waves as he offered a soft smile. Today, We don't just dedicate a new building. We revive trust in medical ethics and compassion, built on the enduring legacy of Thaddeus "Teddy" Marlow. The name Teddy rang like an anthem, sparking chants of Teddy, Teddy, from hearts once broken, now finding refuge. Lula Sparrow smiled faintly, her hand tightening on the edge of her document case. Teddy's final reports, now displayed proudly in the center's heritage room. Stage lights glinted off the silver microphone, catching the sweat on Zephyr's brow like unshed tears of justice. He bowed in gratitude to Dr. Ambrose Wen, who preserved honorable records under pressure, and Sheriff Barnabas Barney Hayes, who shielded truth amid a sea of deceit. Each name drew warm applause, kindling hearts against the chill of exposed lies. When Zephyr invited Lula Sparrow to join him, the crowd erupted. She smiled gently, her eyes gleaming with pride, the Director of Community Outreach badge sparkling on her chest. Zephyr whispered, as if just for her, "Without you, I don't know if I'd have had the courage." Lula smirked, replying softly, "Someone had to keep you from running forever." As the ribbon cutting concluded, the red streamers fluttered like a phoenix's wings rising from ashes. The crowd surged into the main hall, where a long wall displayed a radiant portrait of the Marlow brothers smiling in the old hospital's setting. Fresh paint blended with aged brick, creating a space both dignified and hopeful. Lula Sparrow and Zephyr Marlow walked hand in hand through the guests, pausing at the wall where the inscription, "For Teddy for Truth," glowed golden. Lulu whispered, "See, Teddy's smiling." Zephyr nodded, eyes misty. "I vow to keep the healer's heart." A corridor led to the garden behind the center, where two horses waited under an ancient tree's shade. The fence staff had prepared two saddles, like seats of honor for those who'd ridden through peril. Zephyr Marlow stroked the mane of the old horse, nodding for Lula to mount the other. Soft sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting their shadows on the lush grass like a timeless painting. As they spurred forward, the horses neighed, galloping through the shaded garden, faint dust trailing beneath. The first mark of a new journey. The breeze from the fields carried scents of herbs and damp earth, caressing their cheeks. Lula Sparrow laughed, her hair dancing in the wind, her form like an angel astride a horse in a fairy tale. Zephyr gently touched her wrist, his voice low, "Feel the freedom." She nodded, inhaling deeply, the freedom of justice and love. The world slowed, hoofbeats pounding like a triumphant drum, leaves rustling like a victory hymn. The worn dirt path curved through hills once witness to a deadly chase, now holding only the calm shadows of two riders. At the hill's crest, they halted, gazing down at the valley where the new Teddy-named center nestled among green trees. Sunset rays draped the glass windows, reflecting a blazing red heart, affirming that from ashes the greatest good had risen. Zephyr Marlow exhaled, his lips parting in relief. "This is just the beginning." Lula tilted her head, eyes shining. "From here, every day is a chance to heal." They loosened the reins, the horses grazing, the riders sitting steady, their hearts beating with the wind. On the ride back, the sky turned a dreamy purple, the dirt paths like trails of memory leading to their small hillside home. Lula Sparrow rested her hand on Zephyr's shoulder, her voice warm. "What else will you dream of?" He turned, eyes tender. "You by my side, every day." She smiled, nodding, her fingers brushing his. "Then let's write the next chapter of our lives, one page per dawn." As the sun sank below the horizon, Zephyr Marlow and Lula Sparrow rode side by side into the twilight. Two mended hearts, two souls ready to live every moment, where love and justice met, soaring toward an eternal beginning. Listening to the resilient journey of Lula Sparrow and Zephyr Marlow, I'm struck by the power of friendship and justice. Teddy Marlow's sacrifice in the face of Lucian Blackthorn's schemes moved me deeply. Thank you for joining Millionaire and Heart Stories.